Stop scrolling. What you're about to hear will change how you think. Fire. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, not because of shouting or chaos, but because two people from different generations are speaking past each other in real time, each convinced they're making a reasonable point. Make sure to subscribe to Table Turn and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The moment begins in a way that feels familiar to anyone who regularly watches daytime talk television. The panel is settling into what appears to be a planned, topical discussion tied to a major pop culture moment. Billie Eilish is seated at the table as a guest, there to talk about her recent music, her evolving public image, and her growing role as a voice for younger audiences. The hosts introduce her warmly, and the early exchanges are relaxed. Billie answers questions comfortably, leaning slightly forward in her chair, speaking softly but clearly, offering thoughtful responses that reflect the tone she's known for in interviews. The audience responds with light applause, the kind that signals appreciation without overwhelming the conversation. The discussion naturally shifts toward a broader topic, one that daytime talk shows often explore when a younger celebrity is present. The conversation turns to generational values, social expectations, and how public figures navigate criticism in the age of social media. One of the hosts frames the topic by mentioning how younger artists today are more vocal about boundaries, mental health, and personal autonomy. Billie nods as she listens, her posture relaxed but attentive, hands folded loosely in front of her. Sunny Hostin enters the conversation with a measured tone. She begins by acknowledging Billie's success and influence, praising her talent, and the way she's spoken openly about anxiety and pressure. Her voice is calm, professional, and reflective, the way viewers are accustomed to hearing her speak when addressing cultural or social issues. Sunny then pivots, as she often does, toward a question of responsibility. She talks about the influence celebrities have on young fans and raises the idea that visibility comes with obligations, whether an artist wants them or not. At first, the exchange feels like a standard daytime debate. Billie listens, nodding slightly, her expression neutral but focused. When she responds, she does so carefully, choosing her words in a way that suggests she's trying to be precise rather than persuasive. She explains that while she understands the idea of influence, she doesn't believe it's fair to expect artists to act as moral guides simply because they're visible. Her voice remains even, and she doesn't appear defensive. Instead, she frames her point around authenticity, saying that younger audiences respond to honesty more than to curated examples of perfection. The audience murmurs softly, not in disagreement, but in recognition. This is a conversation they've heard before, framed in slightly different ways depending on the guest. Sunny listens without interrupting, her head tilted slightly, hands resting on the table. When Billie finishes, Sunny responds by emphasizing accountability, particularly in moments when artists speak about controversial topics or model behavior that might be misunderstood. Her tone remains composed, but there's a subtle shift. She leans forward, her voice gaining firmness, signaling that she feels strongly about this point. The tension doesn't spike immediately. It builds slowly, almost imperceptibly. One of the other hosts tries to soften the exchange by adding context, mentioning how every generation redefines norms and how backlash often follows change. The attempt creates a brief pause, allowing the conversation to breathe. Billie smiles politely at the comment, but when Sunny returns to the discussion, she reframes her concern in a more pointed way. She talks about parental perspectives, about viewers who worry that younger fans may take messages at face value without understanding nuance. Billie's body language changes slightly here. She shifts in her seat, uncrossing and recrossing her hands, her shoulders lifting subtly as she inhales before responding. When she speaks, her tone is still calm, but there's more emphasis. She explains that nuance is exactly what her generation is asking for, that young people are capable of critical thinking, and that constantly underestimating them creates a disconnect. She clarifies that she's not rejecting responsibility, but she's rejecting the idea that responsibility should look the same for every generation. Sunny interjects gently but firmly, noting that lived experience shapes perspective and that concern doesn't automatically equal judgment. The interruption is brief, but noticeable. Billie pauses, then nods, allowing Sunny to finish. The exchange remains respectful, but the pace quickens. The hosts begin to speak closer together, with less space between responses, a subtle signal that the conversation is becoming more charged. The studio audience remains quiet during this stretch, attentive rather than reactive. You can sense the room leaning in, not waiting for a dramatic moment, but trying to follow the layered arguments unfolding. Billie responds again, her voice steady but more animated. She talks about growing up under constant scrutiny, about how being watched from a young age changes the way responsibility feels. She emphasizes that her generation wants room to make mistakes publicly and learn from them, rather than being held to rigid expectations defined by older frameworks. Sunny listens, her expression thoughtful but serious. When she responds, she acknowledges Billie's experience but reiterates her concern about long-term impact. She speaks about systems, about how individual actions don't exist in a vacuum, especially when amplified by fame. The disagreement becomes clearer here. It's no longer just about Billie as an artist, but about two philosophies colliding, one centered on evolving norms and self-definition, the other on continuity and caution. Another host attempts to redirect the conversation slightly, suggesting that both perspectives can coexist. The suggestion briefly eases the tension, and there's a moment of shared laughter when Billie jokes softly about how complicated it all is. The audience responds with light applause, appreciating the levity. But the underlying disagreement remains unresolved, hovering just beneath the surface as the segment continues. As the conversation continues, the hosts do not immediately move away from the topic, which is often a signal to longtime viewers that the producers are comfortable letting the discussion breathe. There is no rush to cut to commercial, no visible cue that the exchange needs to be wrapped up. Instead, the moderator allows the panel to stay with the idea of generational responsibility, and the tone subtly shifts from introductory to more analytical. Billie remains engaged, eyes moving between the hosts as each speaks, while Sunny sits upright, hands folded, clearly prepared to expand on her point. One of the co-hosts reframes the discussion by asking Billie how she personally decides what to share publicly and what to keep private, especially knowing how quickly comments can circulate online. The question seems designed to ground the conversation in lived experience rather than theory. Billie answers thoughtfully, explaining that she's learned over time to listen to herself first and to be honest about what she doesn't yet understand. She says that sometimes silence is the most responsible choice, even when people expect a statement. Her voice is calm, but there's a noticeable seriousness to her words. Sunny responds by acknowledging that restraint can be powerful, but she adds that silence can also be interpreted in different ways, particularly during moments of social tension. She references past cultural moments where public figures were criticized for not speaking up. Her tone remains measured, but the point lands with weight. The studio audience is quiet again, and the energy feels more focused. This is no longer a surface-level discussion. It's moving into territory that viewers recognize as complex and unresolved. Billie nods slowly, then responds by saying that her generation is still figuring out how to engage with those expectations. She talks about the pressure to be perfect in real time, to always have the right words ready, and how that pressure can discourage genuine reflection. She mentions that mistakes made publicly tend to follow young artists indefinitely, often without room for growth. Her posture leans forward again, signaling investment, and her hands move slightly as she speaks, underscoring her points without becoming animated. Sunny listens, then gently but clearly challenges the idea that accountability and growth are mutually exclusive. She says that accountability can be part of growth, not an obstacle to it. There's a subtle firmness in her voice now, the kind that viewers associate with Sunny when she feels a distinction is important. She emphasizes that critique doesn't always come from a place of condemnation, but from concern about influence and impact. The exchange becomes more back and forth at this point. Billie responds by saying that critique often doesn't feel constructive when it's delivered publicly and amplified by media cycles. She explains that it can feel less like guidance and more like punishment. The way she speaks suggests she's drawing from personal experience rather than abstract ideas. The audience responds with a soft murmur, not applause, but recognition. One of the other hosts interjects briefly, noting that public discourse itself has changed, becoming faster and less forgiving. This comment acts as a bridge between the two perspectives, and for a moment, the tension eases. Sunny nods in agreement, acknowledging that the pace of modern media complicates everything. Billie also nods, her expression softening slightly, as if relieved to find common ground. But the calm doesn't fully settle. Sunny adds that while the media environment has changed, the core idea of role modeling hasn't disappeared. She talks about how young viewers often emulate not just what celebrities say, but how they respond to criticism. This point introduces a new layer to the discussion. Billie pauses before responding, her gaze dropping briefly to the table, then lifting again. When Billie speaks, her tone is still respectful, but there's a hint of frustration beneath the calm. She says that constantly framing young artists as role models can be limiting, especially when they're still developing their own values. She explains that she didn't choose fame as a platform for guidance, but as a space for creative expression. She clarifies that she cares deeply about her audience, but she believes honesty about uncertainty can be more valuable than projecting certainty she doesn't feel. Sunny responds by saying that intention doesn't erase impact. Her voice remains even, but the point is clear. She emphasizes that viewers don't always distinguish between expression and endorsement. The disagreement becomes more defined here, not louder, but sharper. The hosts are no longer circling the issue. They're addressing it directly. The moderator steps in briefly, acknowledging that this is a nuanced conversation and thanking both women for engaging respectfully. The comment feels intentional, a way to keep the tone grounded and prevent escalation. Billie smiles politely at the moderator, then looks back to Sunny, signaling she's still open to the exchange. Billie adds that she hopes conversations like this can evolve beyond placing the burden solely on individuals and instead examine systems that amplify voices without context. She talks about algorithms, headlines, and how snippets of conversations often travel without explanation. This shifts the discussion slightly away from personal responsibility and toward structural issues. Sunny listens closely, her expression thoughtful. Sunny responds by agreeing that systems play a role, but she maintains that individuals within those systems still have agency. She says that awareness of influence is part of navigating modern visibility. Her tone is steady, and she avoids personalizing the critique. Still, the contrast between her perspective and Billie's remains evident. The studio audience remains attentive, with no audible reactions during this stretch. It's the kind of quiet that suggests viewers are processing rather than choosing sides. Billie finishes her thought by saying that her hope is for intergenerational conversations to be collaborative rather than corrective. She emphasizes listening as much as speaking. As the discussion moves forward, there's a noticeable shift in how carefully everyone at the table is choosing their words. The earlier ease of a guest interview has fully given way to a more deliberate exchange, the kind that happens when a topic unexpectedly resonates beyond its original scope. The moderator acknowledges this by briefly summarizing what's been said so far, framing the conversation as a reflection of broader generational tensions rather than a disagreement between two individuals. This framing helps reset the tone without dismissing the seriousness of what's unfolding. Billie listens closely as the summary is offered, nodding slightly in agreement with parts of it. Sunny does the same, her posture unchanged, her expression focused. When the moderator invites Billie to respond, she takes a moment before speaking, a pause that feels intentional rather than hesitant. She says that she appreciates the chance to have this conversation in a space where nuance is possible, even if it's uncomfortable. Her voice remains soft, but there's a confidence in the way she articulates her thoughts. She goes on to explain that her generation often feels misunderstood, not because older generations don't care, but because the frameworks used to evaluate behavior haven't caught up with the realities of growing up online. She talks about how visibility begins earlier now, how mistakes that once happened privately are now documented and shared. This, she says, creates a heightened sense of self-monitoring that can stifle exploration and honesty. As she speaks, her hands rest flat on the table, a grounded posture that reinforces the sincerity of her point. Sunny responds by acknowledging the reality of growing up online, noting that it presents challenges her generation didn't face in the same way. She speaks with empathy, recognizing the pressure of constant exposure. But she also emphasizes that each generation inherits responsibilities shaped by its context. Her tone is thoughtful, but firm, suggesting that adaptation doesn't mean abandoning standards altogether. The exchange remains respectful, but the contrast in perspective is now unmistakable. Billie responds by clarifying that she isn't advocating for the absence of standards, but for flexibility in how they're applied. She says that rigid expectations can discourage participation, especially among young people who are still forming their identities. She emphasizes that accountability should be paired with understanding, not delivered as public judgment. One of the co-hosts interjects to ask how this plays out when controversial topics arise, especially when fans look to artists for guidance. The question redirects the conversation toward a more specific scenario, and both Billie and Sunny respond with visible attentiveness. Billie answers first, explaining that she tries to be transparent about what she knows and what she's still learning. She says that pretending to have all the answers can be misleading, and that modeling curiosity and humility might be a better approach. Sunny follows by saying that humility is important, but so is clarity. She explains that during moments of crisis or social unrest, ambiguity can be confusing for audiences seeking reassurance or direction. Her voice remains calm, but the point carries weight. She references the idea that leadership, even informal leadership, often requires decisiveness. Billie listens, then responds by saying that decisiveness doesn't always mean certainty. She explains that her generation often values process over proclamation, and that sharing uncertainty can invite collective learning. Her words are careful, and she avoids framing her perspective as superior. Instead, she presents it as different, shaped by a distinct set of experiences. The studio audience remains quiet, but there's a palpable sense of engagement. Viewers at home would likely recognize this as one of those moments where daytime television steps briefly into deeper cultural analysis. Sunny responds by saying that difference doesn't negate responsibility. She reiterates that influence, whether sought or not, carries consequences. Her tone is steady, but the repetition of this point signals its importance to her. The moderator steps in again, noting that both perspectives highlight valid concerns. She asks Sunny whether she sees room for evolving definitions of influence. Sunny considers this, then says that evolution is inevitable, but that some principles remain constant, such as empathy, awareness, and accountability. She stresses that these values can be expressed differently across generations, but shouldn't be dismissed. Billie nods at this, acknowledging the point. She says that empathy is central to how she approaches her platform, and that she believes listening to young voices is part of practicing that empathy. She talks about how often young people feel spoken about rather than spoken with. Her tone is earnest, and there's a slight softening in the room as she speaks. Sunny responds by agreeing that listening is crucial, but she adds that dialogue requires challenge as well as affirmation. She explains that disagreement doesn't have to be antagonistic, and that this conversation itself is an example of that. Her expression relaxes slightly, and there's a hint of a smile as she acknowledges the respectful nature of the exchange. Another co-host comments on how rare it is to see generational differences discussed without devolving into caricature. The comment draws light laughter from the audience, easing the tension. Billie smiles, and Sunny nods in agreement. For a brief moment, the atmosphere lightens. But the core disagreement remains unresolved. Billie concludes her contribution by saying that she hopes conversations like this can continue beyond television, in spaces where young people feel empowered to speak without fear of immediate judgment. Sunny responds by saying that she hopes young people also feel empowered to receive feedback as part of growth. As the segment continues, there's a subtle but noticeable change in pacing. The conversation slows, not because interest has faded, but because the participants seem increasingly aware of how carefully this moment is being watched. The moderator glances briefly toward the audience and then back to the table, signaling that the discussion has reached a point where reflection matters as much as response. Billie remains composed, her posture relaxed but alert, while Sunny maintains her steady, professional presence. One of the hosts brings up viewer perception, noting that conversations like this often spark strong reactions from audiences who see themselves reflected in one side or the other. This comment reframes the exchange as something larger than the two women at the table. Billie responds by saying that she understands that dynamic and that she's aware many young viewers may feel validated simply by hearing their concerns articulated on a mainstream platform. She emphasizes that representation isn't just about visibility, but about being taken seriously. Sunny listens closely, then responds by saying that taking young voices seriously also means challenging them when necessary. Her tone is calm, but the message is clear. She explains that growth often comes from discomfort, and that respectful disagreement can be a form of respect. The way she speaks suggests she's trying to clarify her intentions rather than escalate the disagreement. Billie nods, acknowledging the point, but she adds that the power imbalance between generations can make that discomfort feel one-sided. She explains that when criticism comes from established institutions or figures, it can feel less like dialogue and more like correction. Her voice remains even, but there's an emotional weight to her words that doesn't go unnoticed. The audience remains quiet, absorbing the nuance of the exchange. Sunny responds by saying that power dynamics are real, but that they don't eliminate the need for shared standards. She talks about the importance of bridging gaps rather than widening them, and she frames her perspective as an invitation to conversation rather than a final judgment. Her body language remains open, hands resting calmly on the table. The moderator steps in again, noting that both perspectives highlight the difficulty of navigating influence in a fragmented media landscape. She asks Billie how she envisions healthier conversations between generations moving forward. Billie takes a moment to think, then says that she hopes for more listening and less assuming. She talks about the importance of asking questions rather than making declarations, especially when addressing experiences that aren't your own. Sunny responds by agreeing with the value of listening, but she adds that listening should be active, not passive. She emphasizes that understanding doesn't mean avoiding critique, but engaging with it thoughtfully. Her tone softens slightly, and there's a sense that she's trying to find common ground without abandoning her core position. Another host comments on how the conversation reflects broader cultural shifts, noting that younger generations are redefining authority and older generations are grappling with that change. The comment draws a few nods from the audience, signaling recognition. Billie smiles faintly, and Sunny acknowledges the point with a brief nod. The discussion then turns briefly to the role of media platforms themselves. Billie mentions how headlines often strip conversations of context, turning nuanced statements into simplified narratives. She explains that this can exacerbate misunderstandings between generations. Sunny agrees that media framing plays a significant role, but she reiterates that awareness of that reality should inform how public figures communicate. The exchange remains steady, with neither side raising their voice or showing visible frustration. The tension is intellectual rather than emotional, grounded in differing philosophies rather than personal conflict. The hosts allow the conversation to continue without interruption, recognizing that this is the kind of dialogue viewers tune in for. As the segment approaches its final moments, the moderator acknowledges the depth of the discussion and thanks both Billie and Sunny for engaging thoughtfully. Billie responds by expressing appreciation for the opportunity to speak openly, even when opinions differ. Sunny echoes the sentiment, emphasizing that respectful dialogue is essential, especially in divided times. The studio audience responds with measured applause, not loud or exuberant, but appreciative. It's the kind of reaction that suggests viewers recognize the seriousness of what they've just witnessed. Billie sits back slightly, her expression reflective, while Sunny maintains her composed demeanor. As the segment begins to wind down, the moderator gently signals that time is running short, a familiar moment for regular viewers of daytime talk television. There's no abrupt cutoff, no attempt to rush through final thoughts, but a clear awareness that the conversation must come to a close. Billie and Sunny both seem aware of this, their posture relaxing slightly as the intensity of the exchange eases into reflection. The moderator offers each of them a brief moment for closing thoughts. Billie speaks first, thanking the hosts for allowing space for a nuanced discussion. She reiterates that her intention in speaking publicly is not to dismiss accountability, but to advocate for understanding, particularly for younger voices navigating unprecedented visibility. Her tone is calm and sincere, and she emphasizes that growth is an ongoing process, one that benefits from patience and dialogue rather than rigid judgment. Sunny responds by thanking Billie for engaging openly and respectfully. She clarifies that her perspective comes from a place of concern, not criticism, and that her emphasis on responsibility is rooted in the belief that influence, when acknowledged thoughtfully, can be a powerful tool for positive change. Her voice remains steady, and she stresses that intergenerational conversations are essential for progress, even when they're uncomfortable. The moderator closes the segment by summarizing the key themes that emerged: influence, accountability, empathy, and the evolving nature of public discourse. She acknowledges that there are no simple answers and that conversations like this reflect the complexities of modern culture. The hosts exchange brief nods, signaling agreement, and the camera briefly captures the audience, many of whom are clapping thoughtfully rather than enthusiastically. As the show transitions to the next segment, there's a sense that something meaningful has occurred, even if no resolution was reached. Billie thanks the panel again as she prepares to leave the table, and Sunny offers a polite smile and a few quiet words that aren't picked up by the microphones. The atmosphere remains respectful, with no visible signs of lingering tension. After the episode airs, the conversation continues beyond the studio. Viewers take to social media to share their reactions, with many praising the segment for its depth and civility. Some viewers align more closely with Billie's emphasis on flexibility and understanding, while others resonate with Sunny's focus on responsibility and accountability. Clips of the exchange circulate online, often accompanied by commentary highlighting the generational divide without sensationalizing it. In follow-up discussions, both Billie and Sunny clarify their positions in interviews and online posts, emphasizing that the conversation was never about personal conflict, but about differing perspectives shaped by experience. The show's producers also addressed the segment, noting that the goal was to foster meaningful dialogue rather than provoke controversy. The studio audience reaction is later described as attentive and engaged, with many audience members expressing appreciation for the respectful tone of the discussion. Viewers note that the segment stood out for its lack of theatrics, offering instead a thoughtful exploration of a complex issue. As the dust settles, the exchange is remembered less as a clash and more as an example of how generational differences can be explored constructively on live television. It becomes a reference point in ongoing conversations about influence, responsibility, and the evolving role of public figures in society. And now we want to hear from you. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Table Turn for more narration-based talk show stories.